Let's kick it over to our outstanding interview with Stephen Lassan of Athlon Sports. We're pleased to once again be joined by Stephen Lassan of Athlon Sports. You can follow him at Athlon Stephen. And of course, you know the name by now, college football writer and editor for Athlon Sports and the host of the outstanding Cover 2 podcast. Stephen, thank you so much for joining me once again.
Hey, Mike, it is good to talk to you. I should say, it's always good to talk to you, but it's even better when you look at that schedule for this weekend, man. The SEC slate for week 5 is unbelievable. I'm fired up and ready to get these games underway.
Yeah, when I was listening to, I know you've put out a couple podcasts this week, but the first one in particular, I could just hear the excitement in your voice of
Yeah.
the schedule, not only this week, but next week is looking just as good on paper. So, man, I knew I had to reach out to you and get your thoughts on some of these big SEC matchups. But before we get to the games, another thing that you hit on the Cover 2 podcast, I believe on the Monday episode, I was wondering if you could kind of rehash your thoughts on, the impacts of super seniors. And I think that's something that some people during the offseason kind of rid off because there were so many seniors all across the country. And I think some people looked at it like, is there really an advantage if there's this many seniors? But I certainly think, I don't know what you think, but I certainly think Ole Miss and Arkansas, which I believe are leading the SEC in super senior categories and maybe seniors overall, I think we're really seeing the impact of those players, and it's almost leveled the playing field in the SEC and maybe across the country. Can you share your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it has. So I think when you think about the structure of college football, we know like the elite teams like Alabama, Georgia, most years it's Ohio State, Oklahoma, Clemson. Those teams all lost players to the NFL. And of course, they reload well through recruiting. But what you see is the kind of middle class of college football, where there were guys who maybe weren't elite draft prospects. That last season was just so disruptive in terms of how many games were played and maybe not getting that true senior experience. You had a lot of guys come back. And what I think it's done is it's kind of closed the gap in college football between that top tier and the rest of college football. Because if you think about it, a lot of those top programs lost guys to the NFL because they were, either touted juniors who went ahead and went or had already played like a full 4 years. Whereas some of these teams, like you mentioned, Arkansas and Ole Miss brought some guys back, and in kind of in turn, it's made their roster deeper. It's also made their team better, which I think is kind of propped up the entire mid kind of class of college football, which is made for an interesting season because you still have the elite teams, but I feel like the middle of college football is deeper, which is why we're seeing some of these surprises in the top 25 and why I think the rest of the season could still be pretty crazy as well.
Mm-hmm. All right, one other question I had for you before we get to these games. I just wanted to get your thoughts on this because I know how well versed you are in just not only SEC, but the entire landscape of college football. But in my opinion, it seems like offensive line development has kind of been down for the last couple of years. And now I think we're really seeing it, the impact of it in the SEC. In particular, I think of LSU. I think of Texas A&M. I mean, these are teams that a lot of people had pegged as being SEC West contenders. And I know the season's still young. I'm not writing any of these teams off, but certainly seems like O-line development, not only at those schools, but across the country, like I said, is kind of taking a dip. And I wonder if, that sets up well for a program like Arkansas, where you're going to get top-notch offensive line development as long as Sam Pittman is there in Fayetteville. So what are your thoughts on that?
No question about it. It's a huge problem across the board this year. I can tell you when we did our offensive line rankings for the magazine for the best offensive lines in college football going into this year, I had a really hard time, ranking it. Offensive lines are always hard to rank. Yeah, there's so much that goes into it. There's a lot we don't know too about schematics and stuff just kind of from the outside, but there really wasn't a clear kind of dominant offensive line coming into the season. And last year's best offensive line, Alabama lost a lot. You mentioned LSU, Texas A&M, like those are traditional teams. You would just expect that they're losing a couple guys, they're going to be fine. That's true with, I think Ohio State, Oklahoma, Clemson, all across the board this year. Offensive line play is a concern for a lot of teams, and we're still in week 5, so there's time for these groups to sort things out. But you also, 5 games into the season, 6, we're halfway through the year. At some point, it may not happen this year. So I think that's something that as we go forward, we're going to have to watch because you mentioned Arkansas, that offensive line, of course, I think they have dominated the line of scrimmage for the most part this season. And of course, that's a testament to Sam Pittman. But on a very broad scale, the development of some of these groups like Alabama, like LSU, Texas A&M, even across the board, Oklahoma. If Oklahoma is going to get back into the national title conversation, it's going to be on the offensive line. So there's no doubt about it. Play along the O line this year is not as, I guess, good as we're used to seeing. There is a theory that defenses are a little bit better this year too because of a normal offseason. I think that's true, but I also think that would also benefit O lines because usually you need time to gel and get all those
Hmm.
pieces in. So there's a lot of factors involved, but really it is across the board. OL play is not as strong as we're used to seeing.
All right, Stephen, the main reason I had to have you on all these great matchups here in the SEC, I don't even know where to start, but I'm just going to stick because we're talking about Arkansas. Let's go to the Arkansas at Georgia matchup. The Razorbacks, of course, red hot team, and now Georgia Bulldogs. For my money, I think they're the best team in the country, but maybe some uncertainty in this matchup. I don't know if you heard it there on Wednesday, but Kirby Smart said JT Daniels dealing with some kind of lat injury, and from what I understand, that could be, really, really affect his ability to push the ball down the field. They may have to stick to handoffs and the short passing game, so that potentially complicates this matchup. What are your thoughts on this huge showdown here in Athens?
I love the setup for Arkansas. And I think you talked about this earlier this week. The spread is almost 20 points.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody's giving Arkansas a chance. And I think it's the same setup that's happened against Texas A&M, against Texas. They were the underdog, and we've seen it time and time again with since Sam Pittman has been there at Arkansas. This team believes they can win any game on the schedule with Sam Pittman as the head coach. And I I I think 18, 19 points is too many here. I like Georgia to win this game. But I love the spot for Arkansas and the motivation. You mentioned JT Daniels, and I think we go back to our conversation about offensive lines. I mean, Arkansas dominated A&M. You
Mm-hmm.
look at the rushing yards, they gave up 121, but 67 came on one play. They dominated Texas along the line of scrimmage. So if there's some concern about being able to push the ball downfield, all of a sudden that makes Georgia a little bit easier to defend. So I'm curious to see what Barry Odom and that defensive staff work up. They've done such a great job all season, so it'll be a fascinating matchup to see how they match up. And then, on the other side of the ball, I think it's pretty clear what Arkansas wants to do in this game. They lead the SEC in the most rushing attempts so far this season. And that's kind of how they're setting things up. They want to get that running game going. They're not asking KJ Jefferson to throw 40 times, but man, when he connects on those big plays to Traylon Burks, like we saw last week, they can score in a hurry. So
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of intrigue for me of just how that Arkansas offensive line matches up against a very good Georgia defensive front. Like I said, I like Georgia to win, but I would take Arkansas to cover. I think that the Razorbacks are going to be very much motivated for this one.
Yeah, without a doubt. How about Ole Miss at Alabama, CBS? Man, this game gonna be some fireworks for it, don't you think?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we've got Lane Kiffin and Nick Saban reunited again. We've got two great quarterbacks, Bryce Young and Matt Corral, dueling it out for 4 quarters. It is going to be a fun matchup on Saturday. And, to go to what we just talked about with Arkansas and Georgia, I mean, it's a 14, 15-point spread. Nobody's giving Ole Miss a chance. It's Alabama is number one. So, basically just don't bother showing up, Ole Miss. But, I think there's kind of two ways that this game could play out. The first one is Alabama dominates. They show that the game against Florida was kind of a one game blip. It was a 2 point victory for Alabama. The defense has improved since then. The offensive line's getting better. All that holds true. Or the second one is Alabama's just more flawed. Of course, it's all relative when you're talking about Alabama, and Ole Miss can keep it close and potentially pull off the upset. And you look at the formula that Ole Miss can use, which is they have a quarterback in Matt Corral, who's been arguably number one or number two best quarterback in college football to start the season. They have the difference makers on the outside. They run the tempo that gives every defense, including Alabama, a lot of trouble. So much like last season. I think it is going to be very high scoring. I am curious to see where Alabama has developed since that game against Florida. I think it would not be surprising at all to me to see small things like third downs, red zone, who's getting off the field, decide this game. So also a big test for Ole Miss in that defense too, and to see how much it's improved since last season, because this is by far their biggest challenge.
Now, let me ask you something because people think I'm crazy, and I've done probably 20 interviews this week, and I say the same thing on every one. I think Nick Saban, now I have to start out by saying I think he's the greatest of all time. I don't even think that's debatable at this point. But I think he's lost a step when it comes to his ability to coach up defense. And some people are like, what in the world? They just won the championship. I understand that, but Dan Mullen, last two times faced him. I think Dan Mullen's got the better of them. You go back to just last season, Ole Miss certainly got the better of the defense. You can go back. I know there's a historic team for LSU, but Joe Brady and Joe Burrow got the better of them. Trevor Lawrence in the national championship. I mean, they just shellacked Alabama's defense. And I know I'm kind of like cherry picking, special teams, but how often does Alabama really face a team that can match them? When it comes to talent, it's basically these games I'm referencing, and Alabama's defense is not showing me that they're elite. Do you buy into that, or am I just the world's biggest Alabama hater?
I first of all, I think we're going to find out a lot more about Alabama's defense this week. And there's a stat that jumps off the page to me when I look at Ole Miss is that Matt Corral threw 14 interceptions last season. They all came in losses. So if you're Alabama, you probably need to find a way to get a couple takeaways. I think what you're getting at is sort of it isn't like an issue at Alabama, but I also think it's a broader problem across college football. So I don't know that it's necessarily isolated to Nick Saban in Alabama, because the way that offenses operate right now, they have the upper hand with the
Hmm.
targeting rules, the way that the offensive line can block RPOs. It is really difficult to be a defensive coach and defensive coordinator in college football. So I almost think that Alabama's fighting the same thing that everybody is. And you also can look at Clemson too. Brent Venables, who, got torched in the Sugar Bowl against Ohio State. Tempo, playmakers on the outside, elite quarterbacks, like everything is geared to offense right now. And which is why I think you see what Alabama did a few years ago, going out and getting Lane Kiffin, then promoting, hiring Steve Sarkisian and bringing in Bill O'Brien. Like, you need a high powered offense to win in college football. Your defense doesn't have to be elite. You have to find ways to generate kind of those negative plays, whether that's sacks, a takeaway, getting off the field on third downs. Defense so much now to me is about situational football. And that's why I think, especially in Saturday's game, this is a good chance for Alabama's defense to kind of show us who they are, because they struggled against Florida. This is a much different challenge that Ole Miss will present to them.
Wow, Stephen, that was a really nice way for you to call me an idiot, but you're probably right. You're probably right. Now, hey, those are not the only big games in the SEC. Florida at Kentucky. We're going to find out which of these teams is a true contender here in the East. I know last year was a little one-sided, but Florida had just such a dynamic offense, and Kentucky had no offense. So, But you look past that one. These two have gone, had some real battles here in recent seasons. What are your thoughts heading into this matchup?
Yeah, I think 3 of the last 4 decided by 9 points or less. So,
Mm-hmm.
the series definitely overall trends Florida when you look at the historical run for the Gators here. I think this game to me comes down to the trenches so much. It's kind of opposite of what we're expecting in Ole Miss, Alabama. Here's a kind of an old fashioned SEC slobber knocker. Florida, the way that they are running the ball, over 7 yards a carry. Kentucky giving up around 3 yards per carry. It should be a good battle in the trenches. And also, I think Florida seems to be finding out who they are. Like I think the last couple weeks they've started to figure out what kind of team they have. It's a credit to Dan Mullen because last season it was all about passing and Kyle Trask and Kyle Pitts. This year it's about maximizing what they have out of Emory Jones and those running backs. Not to mention Anthony Richardson. We'll see if he plays in this game. So I'm curious, can Kentucky slow down Florida's rushing attack? And then on the other side of the ball, that Kentucky offense, the last couple weeks has not been as prolific as they started out the year. Will Levis, his yards per attempt has declined in 3 straight weeks. So, is can Kentucky's offense get back on track? This is why you made the move to go out and get Liam Cohen, bring
Mm-hmm.
in Will Levis. This is the type of game that Kentucky will need that. And also for Florida, we think their defense is better. This is a good opportunity. We're still early enough in the year where we're finding out a lot about Florida.
All right, how about Tennessee, Missouri? It seems to me like these teams, I don't want to call it too early, but they're basically playing for a bowl game, is the way. Because if you just look at their schedule, they both have some tough games remaining. Do you got any quick thoughts on Tennessee at Missouri?
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think the winner of this game is in a good spot for bowl eligibility. The loser has a lot of work to do. I'm curious to see if Hendon Hooker plays for Tennessee. What does the quarterback situation look like? I think Hendon Hooker's the better quarterback for Tennessee. I think, also for Tennessee, if you want to win this game, run the ball in Missouri. Man, they have
Mm-hmm.
had trouble all year stopping the run. So it's almost who can run it better, who can stop it better, but maybe some potential for some offense in this game with the way that Missouri's play defense and the way that Tennessee runs tempo.
And what about Auburn at LSU? Is this feels like a game where the loser we can just write them off the way they've both been playing and heck, I know they've neither one's had the season they want so far, but if you win this game, you're still undefeated in the SEC. Any thoughts on this one?
Man, I got no idea what to expect out of these two teams. I mean, you think about Auburn, they looked better against Penn State, and then they didn't really play all that well against Georgia State. LSU has been up and down. I thought the coaching changes and everything going on at LSU would help get them back on track a little bit more than we've seen this year. These are two just unpredictable teams. And you look at the series, Auburn hasn't won in Baton Rouge since 1999. Of course, the quarterback question mark is it Bo Nix, TJ Finley. I think this game comes down to the trenches because LSU and Auburn are at the top of the SEC in tackles for loss. LSU doesn't run it well, and
Hmm.
Auburn does. So I think who can get better pressure and who can probably have a little bit better running game comes out on top. And which is probably going to be a very unpredictable matchup. It starts at 9 Eastern, so this one could get a little crazy.
And last one for you, Stephen. I really appreciate your time. Mississippi State at Texas A&M. I'm not ready to write off the Aggies. I think people are doing that too quickly because I think Arkansas is just that good. I think that loss will look better as the season goes along. But Mississippi State, very inconsistent. I think their youth is finally starting to show. What are your thoughts on Mississippi State at Texas A&M?
Yeah, I think you're right. It's too early to give up on Texas A&M because I think the expectation is Haynes King will be back at some point this year.
Mm-hmm.
Also, the offensive line for Texas A&M should be able to improve as some of that youth gets more experience. So I think that the spot for A&M is crucial here with Alabama coming up. I think if you're Jimbo Fisher, you want to see this team rebound, get back to running the ball. Mississippi State is second in the SEC versus the run, so this would be a good test for Texas A&M's offensive line and ground game. For Mississippi State, that they came close last week against LSU and never really felt like LSU was in jeopardy of necessarily losing that game. But just to see what that high-powered, Mississippi State's offense, can it get on track against a good defense? I think this would be a good test for Mike Leach and Will Rogers for that Mississippi State offense.
All right, he's Steven Lassan. Got to give him a follow at Athlon Steven. Again, subscribe if you're not already to the Cover 2 podcast by Athlon Sports. Steven, I really, really appreciate it. Thanks again for joining the show and dropping so much knowledge on us.
Hey, Mike, anytime. Thanks for having me on, and look forward to talking again real soon.